He was just a poor farmer and a single father, ready to lose everything he had left. But one day after a powerful storm, he found a strange cave entrance on his land. He had no idea what was hidden inside, or how this discovery would change his life forever. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The wind had a way of carrying the past across the valley, whispering through the brittle grass and the dry, broken stalks of last year's corn. It crept under the warped boards of the barn and sighed against the windows of the old farmhouse, as if reminding the man who lived there that time had already taken more than it would ever give back. Samuel Harper stood at the edge of his field, one hand resting on the handle of a shovel planted deep in the earth. He stared out at the gray expanse of land that stretched toward the distant hills, a land that had once been golden and alive but now lay silent under a tired sky. His boots sank slightly into the dust where rain had not fallen for weeks. The smell of dry soil and rust hung in the air. He had worked these acres for most of his life, as his father had before him, and his grandfather before that. Each generation had left its mark upon the land. A new fence line here, a stretch of orchard there. But now it all seemed to fade into one long history of effort and loss. The plow had gone quiet, the animals were gone, and the fields no longer bore enough to fill even a single cart. Samuel had fought the drought, fought the bank, fought his own exhaustion, but there was no fighting what was already lost. The letter inside on the kitchen table had made that clear. 3 weeks. That was all the time left before the farm, his father's land, would be taken and sold to strangers. He knew the words of the letter by heart and had stopped reading it days ago, but still he could see the red ink of the deadline each time he closed his eyes. Inside the house, the quiet was heavy, the kind of silence that carried its own echo. The furniture bore the weight of years, the wood scarred and polished by countless hands that were now dust. The air smelled faintly of smoke and memories. On the wall above the old stone fireplace hung a photograph of a woman, her eyes bright and laughing, her hands folded gently in her lap. Clara, his wife. 2 years had passed since the illness took her, and yet every evening when he sat by the fire, he felt her presence as though she still moved through the rooms, humming softly, filling the empty space with warmth. The only reason Samuel had not collapsed under the weight of loss was the small figure that now came running across the yard, her brown hair tangled by the wind, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust. Ellie, his daughter, 10 years old, restless and curious, with a spirit as untamed as the land itself. She carried a tin bucket in one hand, a half-hearted attempt to fetch water from the old well that had long since turned shallow and bitter. When she reached him, she set the bucket down and looked up, squinting against the light. Her eyes were bright, the same color as her mother's. In them was the spark that Samuel feared to see. Hope, that fragile thing that made disappointment hurt all the more. He tried to smile at her, tried to hide the fatigue that had settled deep in his bones. But Ellie always saw more than he wanted to show. She had seen him sitting alone at night, the unopened letters from the bank spread across the table, the unpaid bills stacked beneath his trembling hands. She had seen the way he stared at the horizon, as though he expected the past to return with the morning light. The days followed one another with the dull rhythm of survival. Each morning he rose before sunrise, not because there was work left to be done, there was little enough of that, but because staying still made the silence unbearable. He mended fences that no longer needed mending, tightened gates that would never again hold livestock. He fixed the old plow for the 10th time, though he knew there would be no crop to turn. His hands had long since turned calloused and cracked, the skin thick and dark from years beneath the sun. Yet those hands trembled now when he reached for his tools, as though the strength that had once sustained him was slowly abandoning him. At night, he sat by the dying fire and listened to the creak of the floorboards, to the groan of the wind pressing against the house. Ellie would sometimes sit beside him, drawing pictures on scraps of old paper. Houses with clean white walls, green fields, and a smiling woman who stood among flowers. Samuel would watch her, his chest tight with an ache that was both sorrow and pride. The girl still dreamed, even as everything around them was falling apart. The first rain in weeks came suddenly, sweeping over the valley in a gray curtain of wind and thunder. It began before dawn and lasted until morning, pounding against the roof, washing dust from the windows, and filling the gutters with brown streams of mud. The sound was both blessing and warning. The dry land drank greedily, but the storm carried a violence that unsettled Samuel's sleep. When the sky finally cleared, the fields glistened in the pale light, scarred with rivulets where the water had cut through the soil. Ellie was the first to see what the storm had done. She had gone out after breakfast to explore, her boots sinking into the softened ground. Beyond the barn, near the old hill where she often played, the rain had torn a gash in the slope, pulling down chunks of clay and stone. The earth there had collapsed into a narrow opening, not wide but deep enough that she could feel a chill rising from within. She crouched beside it, brushing away wet soil, and peered into the darkness. It was not like any animal burrow she had ever seen. The edges were too smooth, too precise, as if cut by hands, not weather. When she leaned closer, a faint breath of air escaped the hole and brushed against her face, cold and damp like the inside of a cellar. Her heart thudded with a strange excitement. There was something about the hollow silence below that pulled at her, as though the ground itself was holding its breath. She reached out and touched the exposed rock, and her fingers slid across a smooth surface that felt almost polished. In the faint light, she saw something pressed into the stone, the outline of a human hand. Not painted, not carved, but as if the rock had once been soft and had captured the imprint before turning to stone. It was too perfect to be a trick of nature. Ellie stared at it, feeling a shiver run down her spine. By the time she returned to the house, her clothes were streaked with mud. She burst into the kitchen, words tumbling over one another in excitement, but her father only frowned. He told her to stay away from the hill, that the ground could still be loose after the rain. She tried to insist, but he raised his hand sharply, not in anger, but in weariness. She fell silent. She had seen that look before, the one that meant there was no arguing. All day the image of the handprint stayed in her mind. When Samuel went to bed that night, she lay awake listening to the quiet ticking of the old clock. The wind had died down, and the world outside seemed to be holding still. Finally, unable to resist, she slipped out of bed, pulled on her boots, and took the small lantern from the shelf. Outside, the night was silver and damp. Mist clung to the grass and the moon hung low above the hills. The ground squelched beneath her feet as she crossed the field. Each step brought her closer to the hill, to the dark line of shadow where the earth had split open. When she reached it, she crouched beside the opening and held up the lantern. The light spilled into the hollow, revealing slick stone walls that descended out of sight. She leaned closer, her breath forming pale clouds in the cold air rising from below. The sound of dripping water echoed faintly from the depths. Then, as she shifted her weight, a clump of earth gave way beneath her hand. The lantern's light trembled. For a moment she thought she heard something, a faint, distant hum, like the whisper of wind through metal. It was so soft she could not be sure if it came from the cave or from her own heartbeat. She stared into the dark, trying to see farther, but the shadows swallowed everything. The lantern flickered, then steadied. The imprint of the hand on the wall seemed to glow faintly in the yellow light, as if some warmth still lingered there. A chill ran through her body, but she could not look away. The air felt alive, moving around her in slow breaths. Then came the sound, a faint metallic ringing from deep within, like a chain stirred in the darkness. Ellie froze. The light wavered again, and the earth beneath her shifted with a soft groan. Panic seized her, and she scrambled backward, the lantern swinging wildly in her grip. The ground crumbled where she had knelt moments before, sending a small cascade of soil and stones tumbling into the hole. She ran, the cold air burning her throat, the farmhouse a dim shape in the distance. When she finally reached the porch, she stopped, gasping, and turned to look back. The hill stood still under the moonlight, but from the dark opening a thin ribbon of vapor rose into the air, curling upward like a ghostly breath. She pressed her hand to her chest, the echo of that distant ringing still in her ears. She did not know what the cave was or what it meant, but she felt certain of one thing. The earth beneath their farm was not as silent as it seemed. Something was waiting there buried deep, and she had awakened it. Inside, her father stirred in his sleep, unaware that the ground outside had shifted once more, the hole widening by another inch. The storm had broken more than the drought. It had torn open the past itself. And beneath that lonely farm, something long hidden had begun to breathe again. Morning came gray and heavy, with a damp mist hanging low over the fields. The night's rain had left the air thick and cool, and the earth still shone wet beneath the first light of dawn. Samuel Harper stepped out onto the porch, rubbing the stiffness from his hands. He breathed deeply, letting the clean scent of wet soil fill his lungs. For the first time in weeks, the dust had settled, and for a fleeting moment, he could almost imagine the land as it once had been, alive, promising, forgiving. But even that illusion faded quickly. The ground beneath his boots was slick with mud, and where the slope rose behind the barn, he could see how the storm had carved ugly scars into the hillside. Ellie came running across the yard, her hair plastered to her forehead, her boots splattered with dirt. She was breathless, her eyes wide with excitement and fear. She began to speak before she reached him, words tumbling out in a rush, telling him everything that had happened the night before. The hole in the ground, the sound from below, the strange vapor that had risen from the earth. Samuel listened, his expression darkening. At first he thought she was exaggerating, perhaps frightened by her own imagination, but something in her trembling hands and the way her voice shook told him otherwise. When she led him to the hill, the sight of it stopped him cold. The gash in the earth was larger now, the edges jagged where the rain had eaten away the soil. The air around it was colder than the morning air, and when he crouched near the edge, a faint breath of chill brushed against his face. He leaned closer and saw that the stone below was not rough or broken. It was smooth, unnaturally so, and he felt a strange unease settle in his chest. This was no simple sinkhole. He looked at his daughter, standing silently behind him. "You shouldn't come near this again," he said quietly. "The ground's not safe." But even as he spoke, he could feel the pull of curiosity gnawing at him. The opening was too deliberate, too unnatural. There was something down there, and he needed to know what it was. Later that afternoon, when the mist had burned away and the sun began to dry the upper soil, Samuel returned with a length of rope, an old lantern, and a small shovel. Ellie followed him, though he told her twice to stay behind. Her stubbornness was something he could never quite fight. Together they cleared the loose stones, widening the gap just enough for a man to squeeze through. Samuel tied the rope around a sturdy root and lowered himself slowly into the hole, his boots scraping against the smooth stone. The lantern's glow wavered on the walls, revealing a narrow passage descending at an angle into the dark. The smell was heavy, a mix of damp clay, iron, and something older like the stale air of a place long forgotten. Ellie crouched above, peering down, her small hands gripping the rope. "Be careful," she whispered. He didn't answer, not because he meant to worry her, but because his breath caught at what he saw ahead. The passage opened suddenly into a small chamber, perhaps 10 feet wide, with walls that curved in rough symmetry. The ground was uneven, littered with stones and rotted wood. When he raised the lantern higher, the light caught the edge of a rusted rail buried beneath silt and gravel. It ran along the floor, disappearing into a tunnel on the far side. He felt a strange chill pass through him. It was unmistakable old mining rails, the kind used to haul ore in iron carts. His father had once spoken of mines in these hills, but those had been sealed generations ago, long before Samuel was born. He had assumed they were myths, the sort of stories men told in the tavern to make the land seem grander than it was. Yet here it was, proof that men had once dug beneath this very ground. "Pa?" Ellie's voice echoed faintly down to him. "What do you see?" He hesitated before answering. "Just old rocks, sweetheart. Nothing dangerous." He didn't want to frighten her, nor did he want to admit how deeply unsettled he felt. The air pressed close around him, thick and cool, whispering faintly in the way of deep, hollow spaces. He took one more slow turn with the lantern, tracing the edges of the chamber. There were marks on the wall scratches, perhaps made by tools, though worn nearly smooth with time. Near one wall lay what looked like a plank of timber, charred at the end, as though it had once been burned. He touched the blackened wood, and a flake came away in his hand. Whoever had worked here had done so long ago, yet something about the place still felt recent, alive even. He shivered, suddenly aware of the weight of the earth above him. It was time to leave. When he climbed back to the surface, the daylight seemed brighter than before. Ellie was waiting, her eyes full of questions, but he said little. He only told her that it was indeed an old tunnel, probably from the mining days, and that they should stay away from it until he could find out more. She nodded, but he could see that same glimmer of fascination he himself had felt, now burning behind her gaze. That night, while Ellie slept, Samuel sat at the kitchen table, the lantern burning low beside him. The map of the county lay open before him, yellowed, creased, the lines faint and fading. He traced the ridges and creeks with his calloused finger, searching for any sign of the old mining operations. The Pine Hollow mine, if it had ever existed, was nowhere marked. The realization brought both unease and temptation. If the mine had been forgotten, then whatever was inside it might have been forgotten too. He leaned back, the chair creaking beneath his weight, and rubbed his eyes. He could almost hear his late wife's voice, gentle and cautious, telling him not to go digging into the past. But desperation is a loud thing. It drowns out reason. The farm was failing, and his options were gone. Maybe, just maybe, there was something down there that could help them. The next morning he told Ellie they would go back one more time, just to make sure the passage was stable. She lit up instantly, though he could tell her excitement came less from safety and more from adventure. They gathered supplies, the same rope, a stronger lantern, and an old pickaxe, and returned to the hill. The air was cooler that day, the kind of chill that seeps into the bones, and the wind moved softly through the dry grass like a whisper. Inside the tunnel, the smell of wet earth and stone was stronger. They moved carefully, Samuel leading the way, Ellie's light bobbing behind him. The rails on the floor grew clearer as they brushed away the loose dirt, and soon they could see the faint outline of another corridor veering off to the right. There were signs of human work everywhere, timbers half buried, broken tools rusted to the color of blood. Ellie stopped suddenly and pointed. "Look!" Her light fell on a small metal plate half buried in mud. Samuel bent down and pried it loose. The inscription was faint beneath the corrosion, but the letters were still legible. Pine Hollow Mining Co., 1903. He stared at it for a long time, his thumb tracing the letters. This was no myth. These men had been here, had dug beneath his land. And if they had abandoned it, why? The question lingered like a shadow. He turned slowly, scanning the chamber again. The silence of the place pressed against him, deeper than the stillness of empty fields. There was a story buried here, one that the world had forgotten. For the first time in years, Samuel felt something stir inside him, a faint flicker of purpose. They stayed below longer than he intended. Time seemed to dissolve in the cool air, the lantern light glinting on wet rock. But as the flame began to dim, he knew they had to return. When they climbed back into the daylight, the sun was already slipping behind the hills. The sky burned orange, and the farm lay below them in the fading glow, small and fragile against the vastness of the valley. As they stood there catching their breath, Ellie turned toward the ridge beyond the field. "Pa," she said softly, "someone's there." Samuel followed her gaze. At first he saw nothing, only the line of trees and the long shadows stretching across the grass. Then just for a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods, motionless, watching. The wind shifted and the figure seemed to fade into the darkness, leaving only the swaying of the branches. Samuel's stomach tightened. Perhaps it was nothing, a trick of the light, a passing traveler. Yet the feeling that crept over him was unmistakable. They were not alone out here. The land that had seemed so empty all these years suddenly felt full again, full of unseen eyes and buried secrets. He put a hand on his daughter's shoulder, guiding her gently toward the house. "Come on," he said quietly. "It's getting dark." As they walked back across the field, he did not look behind them, though he could not shake the sense that the shadows were moving just a little too quickly, closing in before the last of the sun disappeared. That night, after Ellie had gone to bed, Samuel stood at the window, staring toward the hill. The moon had risen, pale and thin, casting the fields in silver. For a moment, he thought he saw a faint light flicker near the ridge, like the glow of a lantern being carried through the grass. He blinked and it was gone. The house creaked softly in the wind, and the clock ticked in the dark. He stayed there for a long time, listening, waiting, his hand resting on the windowsill. The image of that vanished light burned deep into his thoughts. He didn't know who might be out there or what they wanted, but the uneasy truth settled over him like the weight of the night itself. The cave was not forgotten. Someone else knew it was there, and whoever they were, they had come back. The morning that followed was bright but strangely still, as though the storm had scrubbed the world clean and left it holding its breath. The fields glittered with dew, and a soft haze hung over the valley. Samuel Harper had slept little. The memory of that flicker of light by the ridge, the phantom figure watching from the tree line, had stayed with him through the long hours of darkness. He told himself it was nothing, a trick of tired eyes, the play of moonlight on mist. But the thought refused to settle. Even as he went about his chores, his gaze kept wandering to the hill. The ground there seemed different now, disturbed not just by rain but by something deeper, as if the land itself had turned restless. Ellie noticed his distraction. She followed him wordlessly from barn to field, sensing that something had changed, though he said nothing. The silence between them had a weight of its own. At breakfast, she finally asked if they would go back to the cave. He hesitated, his spoon hovering over the bowl. The sensible part of him said no, that he should leave the place alone, board it up if he could. But the memory of the smooth walls, the rails, and that nameplate still echoed in his mind. Pine Hollow Mining Commish, 1903. The date gnawed at him. The men who had worked that mine were long dead. Whatever they had left behind, no one had come back for it. Until now, perhaps. He rose from the table and set his jaw. "We'll go," he said quietly, "but just to see how deep it goes." Ellie's eyes lit up with a mix of fear and excitement, and before he could reconsider, she was already fetching the lantern and the rope. By the time they reached the hill, the sun was high, and the soil had begun to harden after the rain. The opening gaped like a wound in the hillside, its edges caked with dried mud. The air that drifted from it was cool and heavy, carrying the faint smell of rust and earth. Samuel knelt, checking the rope in the old lantern. He tied one end of the rope around a sturdy tree root and looped the other over his shoulder. Ellie stood close, holding the lantern as though it were something sacred. "Stay right behind me," he said, and she nodded. The descent was slower this time, more cautious. The narrow passage forced them to crouch as they moved deeper, their shadows bending strangely across the walls. The drip of water echoed in the distance. When they reached the chamber they had found before, the air seemed colder, the silence thicker. The rails glinted faintly in the lantern's light, half buried beneath the damp soil. The same charred timber lay in the corner, and beside it, Samuel noticed something he had missed before, a small indentation in the ground, almost circular, as though a heavy crate had once sat there. He crouched, running his hand over the dirt. It felt looser here. He picked up the shovel and began to dig, each strike of metal against soil ringing louder than it should have in the close space. The lantern light flickered, throwing trembling shadows against the rock. Ellie watched, wide-eyed, clutching the handle of the rope as if it could somehow pull them both back to safety. After a few minutes, his shovel struck something solid. The sound was not the dull thud of stone, but a hollow clang, the kind that made his pulse quicken. He cleared the dirt with his hands, revealing the corner of a box, a heavy iron-bound chest buried just beneath the surface. The metal was dark with age, the wood swollen and cracked, but it held together. Samuel sat back on his heels, breathing hard. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, though the air was cool. "What is it?" Ellie asked softly. He didn't answer right away. He brushed away more soil, tracing the outline of the chest. The lock was corroded, rust eating through the clasp. He gripped the pickaxe and pried at it. The metal groaned and finally gave with a sharp crack that echoed down the tunnel like a shot. The lid creaked open. Inside, wrapped in stiff, yellowed cloth, lay rows of dull shapes that caught the light with a muted gleam. Silver, bars of it, each one stamped with faint, barely visible markings. Around them were small leather pouches that, when lifted, spilled old coins across the wood. Papers, too, stacked neatly beneath the metal. A ledger, maps, and contracts bound in twine. The air smelled faintly of mold and something sharp like ink long dried. Ellie knelt beside him, her eyes wide in wonder. She reached out to touch one of the coins, turning it between her fingers. It was cold and heavy. "Is it real?" she whispered. Samuel nodded slowly. "It's real." His voice trembled. The weight of the discovery settled on him like a physical force. Silver, real silver, enough perhaps to pay every debt and save the farm, enough to start over. For a long moment he could not move, could barely think. The idea of salvation after so many hopeless years felt unreal, dangerous in its brightness. He thought of his wife, of the promise he had made her to keep the farm alive, to give their daughter a future. Now that promise no longer seemed impossible, but even as hope rose in him, another thought crept in. Why had this been left here? Why had no one come for it? The documents were old, but the chest had been buried deliberately, sealed and hidden. Men did not leave behind treasure willingly. He picked up one of the papers, its edges brittle beneath his fingers. The faded title read, Inventory Log, 1904. The list beneath it mentioned shipments delayed, storage orders, and a final note scrawled in hurried script. Store main yield until transfer. Site compromised. His skin prickled. He replaced the papers carefully and closed the chest. The sound of the lid settling back into place seemed final, almost protective. He turned to Ellie, whose excitement was still burning bright. "We don't tell anyone about this," he said firmly. "Not yet. You understand?" She nodded, though her brow furrowed in confusion. "It's ours, isn't it?" she asked. He hesitated. "Maybe, but sometimes the world doesn't care who things belong to." They covered the chest again, hiding it beneath the loose earth, and climbed back to the surface. The light outside felt too bright, the air too clean after the heavy stillness of the cave. Samuel shielded his eyes and looked toward the ridge. The line of trees swayed gently in the wind, but nothing moved among them. Still, he could not shake the feeling that they were being watched. That night he could not sleep. The image of the silver haunted him, as did the words on the old paper. Site compromised. It meant something had gone wrong down there, something serious enough that men had buried their fortune and never returned. He rose quietly, careful not to wake Ellie, and went to the kitchen. The lantern's glow cast long shadows across the walls. He laid the documents on the table and studied them by the flickering light. The writing was formal, old-fashioned, the ink faded but readable. There were maps, 2 rough sketches showing tunnels, shafts, and veins of ore that crisscrossed beneath the hills. His own land was marked faintly at the edge. He felt a strange chill. The mine extended farther than he had imagined, perhaps under the entire valley. The clock struck midnight. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the flickering flame. If he could prove this silver came from his land, it might all be his by right. The thought thrilled and terrified him. He imagined himself walking into town, paying off the debt, restoring the farm. But another image rose beside it. Dark tunnels, men working by torchlight. The reason they had left in such haste. He could almost hear the echo of their picks striking stone. A sound broke his thoughts, the faint creak of wood from outside. He froze, listening. It came again, deliberate this time, like footsteps on the porch. Slowly he rose, took the rifle from its place by the door, and moved toward the window. The night beyond was empty, moonlight spilling across the fields. But then he saw it, a shadow moving along the fence line, tall and steady. He stepped back, heart pounding. When he looked again, the shadow was gone. Only the whisper of the wind remained. He stayed awake until dawn, watching, waiting. When morning finally came, he walked the perimeter of the farm. Near the edge of the field, close to the path leading toward the hill, he found footprints pressed into the damp soil, too large to be his or Ellie's. The prints led toward the ridge and disappeared among the trees. Whoever had been there had not come by chance. They had known where to look. When Ellie came outside, he forced a smile. "Nothing's wrong," he told her, though his voice was tight. "Just animals." But inside, he knew better. He had seen the way the tracks had sunk deep into the mud, deliberate, careful. Someone had been watching, someone who might know what lay buried beneath their land. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Samuel stood on the porch with the rifle resting in his hands. The air was still again, too still, as if the valley were waiting. The faint scent of rain lingered, mixed with something metallic and sour drifting from the direction of the hill. He looked toward it, his eyes tracing the dark line of the ridge. Somewhere beyond that hill, the mine ran deep, carrying its secrets beneath the soil. He turned back toward the house, the unease settling in him like a weight. Inside, Ellie was at the table, drawing shapes on a piece of scrap paper. A tree, a house, a small hill beneath a round sun. He watched her for a moment, the innocence of her world so fragile compared to the one that pressed against the windows. When she looked up, he smiled faintly and told her to finish before bed. But when the lamps were out and the house fell into silence, he found himself standing again at the window, eyes fixed on the distant ridge. The moon hung low, casting long shadows across the fields. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw movement, a brief shimmer of light where none should be, near the place where the cave mouth lay hidden. Then darkness swallowed it once more. He stood there for a long time, the old rifle cold in his hands, the sound of his own heartbeat filling the quiet room. Whoever was out there had seen the hill, and deep beneath it, the earth still guarded its silver heart, waiting for someone bold or desperate enough to claim it. The wind carried the smell of rain again, a low whisper through the dying stalks of grass that lined the fence rows. For days the sky had stayed the color of old tin, holding a tension that never broke. Samuel Harper worked without focus, mending a length of fence he knew would never hold anything again. The discovery in the cave had unsettled him more than he admitted, and the sight of footprints leading toward the ridge haunted him every time he looked out across the field. Each night since then, he had caught flickers of movement near the tree-lined shadows that dissolved when he tried to fix his gaze on them. Perhaps it was only nerves, he told himself. Perhaps the land, like him, had learned to whisper its ghosts. Ellie tried to lighten the heaviness that had settled over the house, but she sensed her father's unease. Her laughter was quieter now, her steps softer. When she asked whether the treasure meant they could stay on the farm, Samuel's answer was careful and heavy. "Maybe," he said, "but we have to be smart about it." She nodded, but her young heart still clung to hope, while his was wrapped in the dread of what hope could cost. On the third day after finding the chest, Samuel rode into town. The trip was meant to be ordinary, to buy nails, oil, and kerosene. But the air in town felt charged the moment he arrived. Conversations paused when he stepped into the store. Men at the counter exchanged glances. A woman near the shelves whispered something to her companion, and both turned quickly away. Samuel felt the shift and knew without needing to ask. Rumors had already spread. At the counter, old Thomas Greeley, who ran the store for 30 years, leaned on his elbows and spoke in a tone that tried and failed to sound casual. "Hear tell you've been doing some digging up there, Sam," he said. "Find something the rest of us ought to know about." Samuel forced a dry laugh. "Just rocks and trouble," he replied. "Same as always." But Greeley's eyes lingered on him with an uncomfortable knowing, and when Samuel left, he could feel those eyes following him down the dusty street. By the time he reached home, a car was parked at the gate, a dark sedan that did not belong to anyone from around here. A tall man in a gray coat leaned against it, smoking. His hair was slicked back, his face pale and sharp, his expression politely cold. Samuel dismounted and approached slowly. The man straightened, flicked his cigarette to the ground, and smiled in a way that had no warmth. "Mr. Harper, I presume?" His voice was smooth, practiced. "Name's Cray, Edmund Cray. I represent certain interests connected to the Pine Hollow Mining Company." He extended a hand, but Samuel did not take it. "Company's been gone for near a century," Samuel said. Cray's smile widened slightly. "On paper, perhaps. But legal rights have long tails, Mr. Harper. Some of us are still tied to the old lines, you see. Family estates, holdings, obligations." He glanced toward the distant hill as he spoke. "We heard there's been activity on your land, some disturbance of old property. We're here to make sure no one gets hurt." Samuel felt his stomach tighten. "There's nothing down there but stone," he said. "Then you won't mind if my associates take a look." Cray gestured toward the car. And for the first time, Samuel noticed two other figures inside, silent men in hats, their faces shadowed. "You're trespassing," Samuel said quietly. "You can leave the way you came." Cray regarded him for a long moment, then chuckled softly. "Of course, Mr. Harper. We don't wish to intrude, but I'll be staying in town for a few days. Should you reconsider, if you find anything worth talking about, you can reach me at the Pineview Hotel." He tipped his hat and climbed into the car. As it rolled away, dust rose behind the tires like a warning. That evening, Samuel said nothing to Ellie about the visitor, but she sensed something dark in his silence. The house felt smaller, the walls closer. Before bed, she asked if someone was coming to take their land again. He hesitated, then knelt beside her and smoothed her hair. "No one's taking anything from us," he said. "Not this time." But he did not sleep. Near midnight, the sound of a car engine drifted faintly from the distance, followed by the crunch of tires on gravel. He stood at the window holding his rifle and saw a light moving along the edge of the field, a lantern or flashlight sweeping back and forth. It lingered near the ridge before vanishing. When morning came, he found new tracks near the hill and the broken remains of the brush that had covered the entrance to the cave. Someone had been inside. He rebuilt the covering with fresh branches and dirt, though he knew it was useless. The secrecy of the cave was gone. That afternoon, he rode back to town, his mind made up. The silver and the papers were no longer safe hidden beneath the earth. He needed proof that what lay under his land was his bylaw, not rumor or force. At the county office, he found the lawyer his father had once trusted, an old but sharp-eyed man named Wilkes. The lawyer studied the papers with a slow, deliberate care, turning each fragile page beneath his thick glasses. "These are real," Wilkes said at last. "Old but genuine. Pine Hollow Mining Company went under in 1904. Your property line sits square on top of what they called Section 9. According to these records, that section was leased, not owned outright. The lease expired long ago. That makes it yours." Samuel exhaled, a release of tension he had held since the moment he first saw the chest. "Then I can claim it?" Wilkes nodded cautiously. "You can try, but be careful. There'll be others who say different. Men like Cray. They'll come with documents of their own, real or forged. You'll need to file officially and quietly. Don't speak of this until the claim is recorded." Samuel thanked him and left. The sun was setting when he reached home. The horizon streaked with the deep red of approaching rain. The air felt electric, humming with the sense of things closing in. He went to the barn first, intending to check the tools, but the door hung open. Inside, the place was a ruin of scattered hay and overturned barrels. Whoever had come had searched, and searched roughly. He moved through the shadows, his heart hammering, but found no one. Then he saw what was missing: the shovel, the pickaxe, and the small lantern they had used in the cave. "Ellie!" he called, panic rising. No answer. He ran from the barn toward the house, shouting her name again. The yard was empty, the porch door ajar. Inside, the kitchen was in disarray, a chair knocked over. His throat went dry. He rushed outside again, scanning the fields. Then he saw it, the faint trembling light of a lantern moving near the hill. He ran. The wet ground clung to his boots, the wind tearing at his breath. As he neared the ridge, he saw the open hole, its edges raw where the covering had been ripped away. Ellie's small lantern lay in the mud beside it, the flame inside still flickering weakly. He dropped to his knees, his voice echoing into the hollow. "Ellie!" For a moment there was nothing, only the sound of his own pulse in his ears. Then faintly from deep within, he thought he heard her cry out. It was a small sound, distant and thin, swallowed almost at once by the earth. He snatched up the lantern, its light quivering across the stone, and stared into the darkness below. The rope they had used before was still tied to the tree, leading down into the cave's black mouth. He hesitated only a heartbeat before gripping the rope and lowering himself in. The lantern swayed in his hand, casting trembling rings of light on the walls. The cold air rose to meet him like a breath from another world. He could hear movement below, the scrape of metal on stone, the low murmur of voices. As his boots touched the ground, he raised the lantern high. Shadows jumped along the walls, forming shapes that vanished as quickly as they appeared. He moved forward, heart pounding, deeper into the passage. The sound of voices grew clearer. Men, at least two of them, speaking in harsh whispers. The light ahead flickered. Someone else carried a lamp. He caught a glimpse of it around the bend and stopped, pressing himself against the cold rock. "Get the rest of it uncovered," one voice said. "We'll take it tonight." Another answered, lower, tense. "What about the girl?" Samuel's blood turned to ice. The lantern in his hand trembled. He took a slow breath and stepped forward, silent as he could. The air smelled of dust and sweat and the faint sour tang of fear. From the darkness ahead came the soft echo of chains shifting, and then the sharp clink of a shovel striking rock. The sound filled the narrow tunnel. Samuel's grip tightened on the handle of his lantern. Whatever lay hidden in that cave had drawn others to it, men who would kill for what the earth had buried. He moved closer, his shadow merging with the walls, his heart a drumbeat in the silence. Somewhere ahead his daughter waited, and the silver that could save their lives had become the snare that might destroy them both. The tunnel seemed to breathe around him, the walls pulsing faintly with the echo of the men's voices. Then, as he took another step, the loose gravel shifted beneath his boot, and the sound betrayed him. The murmurs stopped. A beam of light swung sharply toward him, slicing the darkness. Samuel froze, caught in its glare. The silence broke with a single word, sharp, cold, unmistakable. "Well," said a voice he recognized as Edmund Cray's. "Looks like Mr. Harper finally came to join us." The lantern's flame wavered, and the darkness pressed closer, heavy with the promise of violence. The cave that had once felt like a tomb now became a trap, and Samuel knew there would be no turning back. The air in the cave was thick and motionless, so heavy that even breathing felt like trespass. The lantern in Samuel's hand flickered weakly, its light throwing uncertain shapes across the walls where Cray and his men stood waiting. Ellie was there too, a few yards away, her small figure half hidden behind a crate. Her face was pale, streaked with dirt, but when she saw her father, she gasped his name, half relief, half terror. Cray raised one hand sharply, and one of his men pressed a pistol to her shoulder. The motion froze Samuel where he stood. "Easy now," Cray said, his voice smooth as silk over stone. "No one needs to get hurt. We only want what belongs to us." He stepped closer, his eyes glinting in the lantern light. "That chest you found, it's company property. Pine Hollow's not yours. And by extension, mine." Samuel said nothing. He could feel the cold sweat on his palms, the weight of the lantern slick in his grip. Behind Cray, two other men were kneeling beside the chest they had unearthed again, brushing away the last of the dirt. The lid was open now, and the dull gleam of silver filled the chamber with its ghostly light. "You broke into my land," Samuel said quietly, his voice raw. "You took my daughter. You think I'll let you walk out with that?" Cray's expression softened into mock sympathy. "Let," he repeated with a dry laugh. "Mr. Harper, you don't seem to understand. This was never yours to begin with. You stumbled into history you can't rewrite. The men who buried this had orders to return when the law turned its eyes away, but they never did. Their claim still stands, and I am here to see it fulfilled." Ellie whimpered, and the sound tore through Samuel like a blade. He looked at her, her small hands bound behind her back, and something in him hardened. For years he had been bent beneath the weight of failure debt, drought, loss. But the sight of her there broke through the weariness. For the first time in a long while he felt anger burn hot and clear. "You talk about history," he said, stepping forward, "but you're just another thief." Cray's smile vanished. He tilted his head slightly. "A thief, perhaps, but one with purpose. Step any closer, and she pays for your pride." The man holding Ellie cocked the pistol with a click that echoed off the stone. The cave fell into a tense silence. Samuel could hear water dripping somewhere deep in the tunnels, slow and steady. His mind raced. He had no weapon, only the lantern and his hands. But he had spent his life in these fields, his muscles shaped by years of work, his endurance forged by necessity. Cray and his men were softer, their strength borrowed from greed, not labor. Cray turned his gaze back to the chest, his voice cool again. "Help us carry it, and maybe we'll leave your girl unharmed. Fight, and the cave becomes her grave. Samuel's hand trembled around the lantern handle. For a moment, he considered doing as Cray said, just long enough to get Ellie away. But then he saw it, the old timbers bracing the ceiling above the chamber. They were cracked, dark with rot, held together by nothing more than the stubbornness of age. The rain from the storm had weakened the rock. A thought flickered through his mind like lightning, reckless and desperate. He stepped forward slowly, as though surrendering. "All right," he said hoarsely. "I'll help." Cray gave a curt nod. "Smart man." Samuel moved toward the chest, his boots scraping against the stone. He set the lantern down near the center of the chamber, its glow spilling upward. One of the men shifted to make room for him, muttering something under his breath. Samuel bent as if to grip the side of the chest, but instead he swung his arm hard, sending the lantern crashing into the nearest timber. Glass shattered, and the oil inside splashed across the dry wood. Flame burst to life with a roar, hungry and fast. For a heartbeat, the cave froze in shock. Then chaos exploded. Cray shouted, his voice breaking into fury, and one of the men fired his pistol wildly, the sound deafening in the confined space. Samuel lunged toward Ellie, tearing her free from the man who held her. The child stumbled but clung to him, her face pressed against his chest. "Run!" he shouted, dragging her toward the tunnel. Behind them, the fire climbed the wall, licking greedily at the timbers. Smoke filled the chamber, thick and choking. Cray's curses echoed through the haze as he barked orders, his men scrambling to save the chest. But the supports were already giving way, the ceiling groaning under the strain. Samuel and Ellie stumbled into the narrow passage, half blind, the air thick with dust. Rocks rained down around them, each one striking with a dull thud. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Ellie coughed, her small body shaking, but Samuel urged her on, his arm tight around her. Behind them, a deep rumble rose, a sound like thunder trapped underground. When they finally reached the entrance, the cold night air hit them like salvation. Samuel lifted Ellie up and pushed her toward the surface. She scrambled out, gasping for breath, and turned to pull at his hands. But before he could climb free, a sharp crack split the air, followed by the roar of collapsing stone. The opening behind him flashed with light and then vanished in a wave of dust and flame. The mine had caved in. "Pa!" Ellie screamed, her hands reaching for him. He pulled himself the rest of the way up, his lungs burning, and rolled onto the wet grass beside her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They could only lie there, staring at the hill as it shuddered and settled, sealing its secret forever. When the sound finally died, the world was silent again. The sky was dark, the first drops of rain beginning to fall. Ellie clung to him, trembling. "Are they gone?" she whispered. Samuel looked toward the ridge where the cave had been. Smoke drifted up from the earth, faint and gray, curling into the wind. "Yes," he said quietly. "It's over." They walked back to the house through the rain, their clothes soaked, their faces streaked with dirt. The storm broke fully before they reached the porch, washing the fields clean. The barn loomed ahead, half shadowed in the flashes of lightning. It looked smaller now, but safer, like the heart of something that had survived. Inside, Samuel lit a fresh lamp and sat Ellie by the fire. She fell asleep quickly, exhaustion overtaking fear. He watched her for a long time, his heart heavy but steady. The treasure was gone, buried again under tons of earth, but the land was still theirs. Days passed before anyone came asking questions. The sheriff arrived first, hat in hand, saying he'd heard about strange men seen near Harper's property and a noise like thunder in the hills. Samuel told him a version of the truth. Trespassers had come. There'd been an accident, a collapse. The sheriff studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You're lucky to be alive," he said. "Those old mines aren't fit for breathing, let alone digging." Samuel only nodded. When the lawman left, he went out to the field where the hill had caved in. The rain had washed the earth smooth, and no sign of the entrance remained. No rails, no timbers, no glint of silver. The past had swallowed itself whole. Weeks turned into months. The rumor of hidden treasure still drifted through the town, but no one dared return to search. The mine was cursed, they said, a place that punished greed. Samuel let them believe it. He repaired the barn, planted the spring crops, and little by little, the land began to heal. Sometimes at dusk, when the sun burned low and red across the valley, he would stand at the edge of the field with Ellie beside him, watching the light fade. She was growing fast, her laughter returning, her eyes bright again. When she asked about the men or the treasure, he told her simply that some things were meant to stay buried, and that what mattered was what they still had: the farm, the soil, each other. Years later, when the farm was thriving again and Ellie was nearly grown, Samuel took her once more to the ridge. The hill was green now, grass thick where the earth had once been torn open. He placed his hand on her shoulder and said, "Everything we need is above ground. Remember that." She nodded, her gaze steady on the horizon. The wind moved softly through the grass, carrying the faint scent of rain. Beneath them, deep in the earth, the silver still slept, locked away forever beneath the stones of Pine Hollow. The secret had cost blood and fire, and in the end it had given back only one truth: that some treasures are not meant to be taken, but to remind those who find them what it means to lose and to live. As father and daughter turned to walk home, the last light of the sun caught the fields and made them shine, not with the cold gleam of silver, but with the quiet glow of a life rebuilt from the ruins. And though the world would never know what the earth had once hidden, Samuel Harper carried its lesson in his heart: that hope, not wealth, was the truest inheritance the land could give. If this story moved you, don't stop here. Hit subscribe now so you never miss the next one. Watch the next video on your screen for another story that will leave you speechless. And share this video with someone who still believes there's always hope beneath the hardest days.